My hand was already on my weapon before my mind understood why. That is how it always started for me. Not with thought, but with instinct, a tightness behind the eyes, a prickling on the back of my neck. Years of training had carved that response into me so deep that it no longer felt like a choice. It felt like breathing. I am Daniel Cole, and on the day this story truly begins, I was standing 3 steps behind Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen in a glass hallway 200 meters above the Earth, inside Meridian Station, the newest and most fragile piece of diplomacy our species had ever built. My job was simple on paper: protect her, keep her breathing, make sure the treaty she was here to sign actually got signed. In practice, my job felt like standing guard over someone who wished I did not exist. Let me back up, because you need to understand what led to that hallway, that morning, and the tightness in my chest that told me something was wrong before my eyes caught up. 6 weeks earlier, I had been pulled out of a training rotation and told I had been selected for the Interspecies Protection Directorate. I remember laughing at first, not because it was funny, but because it seemed impossible. Humanity had only had open contact with another spacefaring species for 2 years. The Solari Concord, an alliance of 3 advanced civilizations, had opened a narrow diplomatic channel with Earth after decades of quiet observation. Nobody had expected an alliance. Nobody had expected trade routes. And nobody, least of all me, had expected that a human soldier would be trusted to guard one of their ambassadors with his own body. But here I was. Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen arrived on a shuttle that folded light around itself like fabric, and stepped out wearing robes that shimmered the color of deep ocean water. She was tall, taller than any human I had stood beside, with skin that had a faint metallic sheen, and eyes that moved independently of each other, scanning everything at once. Her people, I would learn, had reached a point in their evolution where violence had become almost a memory. Their cities had no weapons. Their history books barely mentioned war. They had outgrown it, or so they believed. The first time she looked at me, she did not see a soldier. She saw an accessory, a leftover requirement from an old Earth treaty that insisted a local security escort accompany any visiting dignitary. To her, I was not protection, I was decoration, a formality, a curiosity, like a house pet that had been given a uniform. "You may walk behind me," she said that first day, without turning her head. "Try not to be noticeable." I said nothing. I had been trained for worse insults than that. Over the following weeks, the insults grew smaller in size but sharper in edge. She questioned why I carried a rifle instead of a proper defense field. She asked, in front of other delegates, whether human eyes were capable of seeing threats before they happened, or only after. She once compared my reflexes to those of what she called a young sapling species, implying we were still growing into whatever we were meant to become. I never argued. I never raised my voice. I did my job. Because here is something Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen did not understand, something none of the Solari Concord delegates seemed to grasp about humanity at all. We are not an old and gentle species that forgot how to fear. We are a young and dangerous one that never stopped needing to. Her people had spent generations without predators, without famine, without war. Their civilization had smoothed itself into something calm and comfortable, and in doing so, they had lost something else along with the violence. They had lost the instinct, the edge, the part of the brain that stays half awake even during rest, listening for danger in the dark. We never lost that. We could not afford to. That morning in the glass hallway, 3 steps behind her, I felt that old edge come alive again. She was mid-sentence, speaking to a Solari attaché beside her about station security protocols, laughing lightly at something he had said. Around us, the hallway curved along the outer ring of the station, glass on one side showing the curve of the Earth far below, sealed panel walls on the other, embedded with narrow observation windows used by station maintenance crews. I was watching those maintenance windows. I always watched them. It was a habit no alien guard would have thought twice about, because their species had grown so accustomed to safety that they no longer imagined danger tucked into ordinary places. And that is when I saw it. A flicker, barely a flicker, a reflection where there should not have been one, in a window that should have been dark and empty on the maintenance side. My hand found my weapon. My feet slowed half a step, positioning my body slightly ahead of her, not enough to be obvious, but enough to matter if something happened in the next second. Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen noticed my movement and turned her head, her twin eyes narrowing. "Is something wrong, Guard Cole?" she asked, her tone carrying that familiar edge of amusement, as if she already expected the answer to be nothing. "Not yet," I said quietly, still scanning the maintenance window. She let out a small sound, something between a laugh and a sigh, the kind of sound a person makes when they are humoring a child. "You humans," she said, turning back to her attaché, always so certain that danger is hiding just around the corner. It is almost endearing. I did not answer her. My eyes had already moved past the window, checking the angles of every door, every vent, every place a threat might come from. This was not paranoia. This was training. This was the thing that made humans different from every species we had met so far. We had learned, the hard way, over thousands of years, that safety was never guaranteed, that the world could turn dangerous in the space between one breath and the next, that the price of forgetting this lesson was often paid in blood. The Solari Concord had never paid that price, not in living memory. And so they walked through hallways like this one without a second thought, trusting that danger belonged only in stories. I envied them, in a strange way. I envied the ease with which they lived. But I also knew, in the marrow of my bones, that ease like that could not last forever in a universe as wide and unpredictable as this one. The flicker in the window did not repeat. Nothing else happened in that hallway. We reached the end of the corridor, passed through a security checkpoint manned by 2 more of my colleagues, and entered the main diplomatic wing without incident. Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen did not mention the moment again. She had already dismissed it from her mind, tucking it away as another example of human overreaction. But I did not dismiss it. I logged the location. I logged the time. And later that day, when I had a private moment, I pulled the maintenance access records for that section of the station and found something that made the back of my neck prickle all over again. According to the records, no maintenance crew had been scheduled in that corridor for 11 days. Someone had been in that window who was not supposed to be there. I flagged it to station security, filed a report, and received the response I had come to expect from anyone who was not human and had never needed to survive on instinct alone. Noted. Likely a reflection from external light sources. No further action required. I read that message twice, standing alone in the small quarters they had given me near the diplomatic wing, feeling something settle heavily in my chest. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to certainty. The quiet, cold certainty that comes when you have seen a wolf's shadow before anyone else in the room believes wolves exist. I did not sleep well that night. The following morning, I was back in position 3 steps behind Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen as she walked toward the grand hall where the final round of treaty negotiations would begin. She wore robes even more elaborate than before, deep blue fabric that seemed to hold starlight within its threads, marking the importance of the day. She glanced at me once as we walked, her expression unreadable in that alien way of hers, eyes moving independently, one fixed on the corridor ahead, one flicking briefly toward me. "You look tired, Guard Cole," she said. "Did the shadows keep you awake?" There was no cruelty in her voice, not exactly. It was closer to genuine curiosity, the way someone might ask a child why they were afraid of the dark, expecting the answer to be nothing at all. "Something like that," I said. She made that small amused sound again, the one I had come to recognize as her version of laughter, and turned her attention back to the hall ahead of us, where dozens of delegates from both our worlds were already gathering. I followed 3 steps behind her, my eyes moving across every doorway, every window, every shadow that did not sit quite right. I did not know yet how right I was. I only knew that my hand had found my weapon before my mind understood why, And that feeling, more than any insult she had ever thrown at me, was the one thing I trusted completely. The Grand Hall of Meridian Station had been designed to impress every species that walked through its doors, and it succeeded without effort. The ceiling curved upward into a dome of reinforced glass, showing the black of space and the slow-turning blue of Earth beneath it. Long tables stretched across the polished floor, each one marked with the flags and symbols of the nations and worlds represented that day. Servers moved quietly between the tables, carrying trays of food and drink meant to honor both human and Solari customs at once. I stood near the entrance of the hall, close enough to Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen to reach her within 2 seconds if needed, far enough to remain out of the direct line of conversation. This was the balance every good guard had to strike, close enough to matter, distant enough to be forgotten. She never let me be forgotten. "Guard Cole," she said, her voice carrying easily across the space near her seat, loud enough that several nearby delegates turned to listen. "Come closer. I would like my colleagues to see what Earth considers proper security." I stepped forward, keeping my expression calm, my posture steady. I had learned by then that resisting these moments only made them longer. She gestured toward me with one long, elegant hand, addressing a cluster of Solari diplomats and a few visiting delegates from allied worlds. "This is Daniel Cole," she said, "one of Earth's finest soldiers, or so I am told. Notice how he carries a projectile weapon, a weapon that requires him to see danger, aim at danger, and react to danger, all within the span of a single heartbeat. Fascinating, is it not? Like watching a much older kind of animal try to keep pace with a modern world." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the gathered delegates. Not cruel laughter, not exactly. More the kind of laughter people offer when they do not know any better, when they have never had to imagine a world where danger could not be filtered out or engineered away. I kept my eyes moving across the room, the doors, the windows, the places a threat might hide. "Do you know," she continued, turning fully toward me now, clearly enjoying the attention of the small crowd around her, "on my homeworld, we resolved conflict through structured negotiation over 400 years ago. We have no need for guards who carry weapons of harm. Our security relies on early prediction, on data, on foresight so advanced that violence becomes almost impossible to attempt. And yet here you stand, Guard Cole, with a device built entirely around the assumption that violence will happen anyway." "It happens more often than people expect," I said quietly. She tilted her head, both eyes fixing on me at once, an expression I had learned meant genuine surprise. It was rare for me to speak unprompted, and rarer still for me to disagree with her in front of others. "Is that so?" she said, amusement returning to her voice. "Tell me, Guard Cole, in your professional opinion, how many attempts on my life do you believe have occurred since I arrived on this station?" The question was meant as a joke. I could hear it in her tone, could see it in the way the delegates around her smiled, already anticipating an answer of 0, an answer that would prove her point about human paranoia being nothing more than an outdated evolutionary leftover. I thought about the 11 days since the last scheduled crew. I thought about the report I had filed and the dismissive response it had received. "One that I know of," I said, "possibly more that I do not." The room went quiet, in a way it had not been quiet before. Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen's amused expression faltered, just slightly, before she recovered it with practiced ease. "You are being dramatic, Guard Cole," she said, though her voice had lost a small measure of its confidence. "There have been no security incidents reported during my visit. There was an unreported presence in a restricted maintenance corridor 2 days ago," I said. "I filed the report myself." "And what came of this report?" "It was dismissed as a reflection of external light." She studied me for a long moment, her twin eyes moving in that unsettling independent way, one still watching the nearby delegates, one now fixed entirely on me. I could see the calculation behind her expression, the effort of deciding whether I was exaggerating for effect or telling the truth as I understood it. "You truly believe someone was watching me," she said, quieter now, the performance for the crowd fading from her voice. "I believe someone was somewhere they were not supposed to be," I said. "That is enough for me to stay alert." For a moment, just a moment, something shifted behind her eyes. Not fear, not yet. Something closer to reconsideration. But then one of the nearby Solari attaches, a younger diplomat named Ren Salas, leaned in with a light laugh and broke the tension entirely. "Ambassador, forgive me, but this sounds exactly like the human tendency to see danger in shadows. Our own security systems would have flagged any genuine threat within microseconds. A human relying on instinct and memory cannot compare to predictive scanning." Several delegates nodded in agreement, and I watched Ambassador Vexthera Olkeen's expression harden back into its familiar shape of amused superiority, as if she had needed the reminder that doubting her own systems was, in itself, a kind of embarrassment she could not afford in front of her peers. "Quite right," she said, turning back to the group, her voice regaining its light, mocking tone. "Guard Cole means well, of course. Humans are still learning to trust the tools that keep them safe, rather than their own uncertain senses. It is, in its own way, rather charming." The laughter returned, softer this time, and the conversation moved on to matters of trade routes and resource allocation, leaving me standing 3 steps back once again, exactly where she believed I belonged. I did not argue further. Arguing would not have changed anything. What mattered was not whether she believed me. What mattered was whether I stayed ready. The hours passed slowly after that. The negotiations moved through details of shared technology, agricultural exchange, and travel corridors between Earth and Solari space. I listened to none of it directly. My attention split instead between the doors, the windows, the servers moving between tables, and the small gaps of silence that sometimes told me more than any conversation could. It was during one of those gaps, roughly 2 hours into the gathering, that I noticed something small but wrong. A member of the serving staff, a young man I had not seen during earlier briefings, moved along the far wall of the hall with a tray of drinks. His uniform matched the others perfectly. His movements were smooth, practiced, unremarkable, but his eyes were not. Every other server in that hall moved with the relaxed confidence of someone performing a routine task among people they had no reason to fear. This man's eyes moved the way mine did, scanning, measuring distances, checking exits. It was subtle, so subtle that I doubted anyone without my exact training would have noticed it at all. I shifted my position slightly, angling myself for a better view of him, careful not to draw attention. He did not approach Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen directly. He simply moved along the far wall, refilled a few glasses at a nearby table, and disappeared through a side door marked for staff only. I made a note of the time. I made a note of the door, and when a brief lull in the proceedings gave me the chance, I quietly radioed station security, requesting confirmation of staff assignments for the gathering. The response came back several minutes later, delivered through my earpiece in the calm, disinterested tone of someone reading from a screen rather than paying real attention. All serving staff accounted for. No discrepancies noted. I asked for the name of the individual who had exited through the side door near the western wall approximately 10 minutes earlier. There was a pause, a longer pause than I liked. No staff member logged an exit through that door during the specified time frame. I felt that same cold certainty settle over me again, the one from the night before, standing alone in my quarters after reading the first dismissed report. Someone had been in that hall who was not supposed to be there, someone whose eyes moved like mine, whose training clearly matched a very different purpose than serving drinks at a diplomatic gathering. I did not mention this to Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen, not yet. I had already learned that raising concerns without solid proof only invited more ridicule, more dismissal, more confidence in the idea that human caution was simply an old animal instinct with no place in a modern, predictive world. Instead, I stayed close, closer than protocol required. Close enough that when she glanced back at me during a pause in the negotiations, clearly intending another light remark about human nervousness, she saw something in my expression that made the words die before she spoke them. "You are watching something," she said quietly, this time without an audience nearby to perform for. "I am watching everything," I said. "That is the job." She studied me a moment longer, her twin eyes narrowing slightly, and for the first time since her arrival, I saw something in her expression that was not quite amusement, and not quite doubt. It was closer to the beginning of a question she was not yet ready to ask. The gathering continued. The delegates spoke of futures built on cooperation and trust, and somewhere beneath the polished floor, beyond the reach of predictive systems that had never needed to imagine true danger, something was moving into position, patient and unseen, waiting for a moment none of them believed could ever arrive. I did not know the exact shape of what was coming. I only knew, with the same certainty that had once saved my life on Earth, long before any of this began, that it was already closer than anyone in that hall could imagine. The final ceremony began at exactly noon station time, marked by a soft chime that echoed through the grand hall and drew every delegate to their feet. This was the moment the entire visit had been building toward. Ambassador Vextera Olkeen would step onto the raised platform at the center of the hall, sign the treaty documents alongside 3 human representatives, and formally open the first true alliance between Earth and the Solari Concord. I moved with her as she crossed the floor, staying exactly 3 steps behind, my eyes sweeping the room in slow, practiced arcs. The hall had filled since the morning, with additional delegates arriving from allied worlds, along with several members of the human diplomatic corps and a handful of journalists cleared for coverage of the historic signing. More people meant more angles. More angles meant more places for something to go wrong. The platform stood at the center of the hall, elevated slightly above the surrounding floor, ringed by a low glass barrier meant more for ceremony than protection. Behind it rose the great curved window that made up one entire wall of the hall, showing the endless black of space and the slow-turning shape of the Earth far below. It was beautiful. It was also, from a security standpoint, the single most exposed position in the entire station. I had raised this concern during the planning stages weeks earlier. I had suggested a platform positioned against a solid wall, away from any direct line of sight from outside structures or docked vessels. My concern had been reviewed and dismissed, politely, by a joint committee of human and Solari planners, who agreed that the symbolism of signing the treaty in front of the Earth itself outweighed any theoretical risk. Predictive scanning systems, they assured everyone, would detect any threat long before it became relevant. I had not argued further. I had simply made a note, the way I always did, and promised myself I would stay closer than protocol required. Ambassador Vextera Olkeen stepped onto the platform, her robes catching the light streaming in from the great window behind her, and turned to face the gathered delegates. She looked, in that moment, every bit the confident diplomat the cameras wanted to capture. Calm, composed, untouchable. I positioned myself at the base of the platform, close enough to reach her within a single second if needed, my eyes still moving across the room in slow, careful sweeps. Doors, windows, faces. The serving staff along the far wall, none of them matching the strange eyes I had noticed earlier. The journalists near the front, cameras raised. The delegates seated in careful rows, some watching the ambassador, some watching each other, most watching nothing at all beyond the ceremony itself. She began her speech. Her voice carried easily across the hall, smooth and practiced, speaking of unity between worlds, of a future built on cooperation rather than conquest, of 2 species finding common ground despite the vast differences between them. It was, I had to admit, a genuinely moving speech. Even I found myself listening, just for a moment, caught in the weight of the occasion. That single moment nearly cost everything. Because it was in that same breath, that same brief lapse where my attention drifted from pure scanning to genuine listening, that I caught the faintest flicker of red light sweeping across the polished floor near the base of the platform. My body reacted before my mind fully registered what I was seeing. A thin, precise line of red light, barely visible against the pale floor, moving in slow, deliberate arcs, searching, calibrating, adjusting for distance and angle. I had seen light like that before, long ago, in training exercises that had taught me to recognize the signature of a targeting system locking onto a location. It was not calibrated on the floor, not anymore. It moved upward, sliding along the base of the platform, climbing toward the low glass barrier, and finally settling, steady and unwavering, directly onto the deep blue fabric of Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen's robes, directly onto her chest, a small, perfect red dot glowing softly against the fabric, invisible to anyone not trained to search for exactly that kind of danger. Time did something strange in that moment. It did not slow down in the way stories often describe. It sharpened instead, every detail suddenly vivid and separate, as if my mind had reached out and grabbed hold of the scene, refusing to let a single piece of it blur past unnoticed. I saw the angle of the light, tracing it backward in my mind, to a source somewhere beyond the great curved window, likely from a docked vessel, or a maintenance platform positioned outside the station's outer hull, a location no predictive scanning system had been designed to monitor, because no one had ever imagined a threat originating from outside the supposedly secure boundary of the station itself. I saw the delegates around me, none of them reacting, none of them even noticing the dot of red light resting quietly on the ambassador's chest, because none of them had ever needed to learn what that light meant. I saw Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen continue speaking, unaware, her twin eyes moving between the crowd and the treaty documents laid out before her, completely blind to the death that had just aimed itself directly at her heart. And I saw, in the space of that single frozen heartbeat, exactly how many steps separated me from her, exactly how much time remained before that red dot would become something far more permanent, and exactly what I needed to do next. There was no time for warnings, no time for radio calls to station security, who would have taken precious seconds to understand a threat their own systems had failed entirely to detect. No time for hesitation, for doubt, for the kind of careful, measured response that might have made sense in any other situation. There was only time to move. I crossed the distance between us in a blur, my body moving with a speed that came not from thought, but from years of drilled reflex, muscle memory built through countless hours of training that existed for exactly one purpose: to close impossible distances in impossibly short amounts of time. Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen had just enough time to turn her head toward me, her expression shifting from calm authority to genuine confusion, as if trying to understand why her supposedly primitive human guard was suddenly moving with a speed that defied everything she believed about the limitations of her species. I did not explain. There was no time to explain. I reached her a fraction of a second before the light on her chest could finish whatever calculation it had been performing, and I drove my shoulder into her side, wrapping my arms around her and pulling both of us down and away from the exact spot the red dot had marked with such patient precision. The world tilted sideways. The great curved window filled my vision for a single spinning moment, the black of space and the blue curve of the earth blurring together as we fell toward the platform floor. I felt the impact of the fall through my own body, absorbing what I could of it, twisting instinctively so that my back and shoulder took the brunt of the landing rather than her. And then, a fraction of a second later, the world exploded into sound. A sharp, cracking impact struck the reinforced glass barrier exactly where Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen had been standing only a heartbeat before, the sound tearing through the stunned silence of the hall like something breaking apart the very foundation of everyone's understanding of what was possible in this place. The glass barrier held, barely, spider-webbing outward from the point of impact in a pattern that made it clear exactly how close the shot had come, and exactly what would have happened if I had been half a second slower. For one long, suspended moment, the entire hall froze. Delegates who had spent their entire lives believing violence belonged only to old stories and distant history stared in open shock at the shattered pattern spreading across the glass barrier. Solari security personnel, trained in systems built around prediction and early detection, stood frozen in place, their advanced sensors clearly having failed to anticipate a threat originating from beyond the station's expected boundaries. Journalists who had raised their cameras to capture a historic signing instead captured something entirely different, something none of them had ever expected to witness. And beneath all of it, pressed against the platform floor, with Ambassador Vexthara O'Keen held safely beneath the shield of my own body, I was already moving again. "Stay down," I said, my voice low and sharp, cutting through whatever shock still held her frozen beneath me. "Do not move until I tell you it is safe." Her twin eyes, wide with something I had never seen in them before, something that looked remarkably like genuine fear, met mine from a distance of only a few inches. For the first time since her arrival on this station, Ambassador Vexthara O'Keen said nothing at all. No mockery, no amusement, no confident dismissal of human instinct as an outdated evolutionary leftover. Just silence, and the sound of her own breathing, rapid and uneven, finally understanding in the space of a single heartbeat exactly what that small red dot on her chest had meant. I risked a glance upward, tracing the angle of the shattered impact point on the glass barrier back toward its likely origin, confirming what I had already calculated in that first frozen moment. The shot had come from somewhere beyond the great curved window, from a position outside the station's primary security perimeter, a blind spot created by the very confidence that had convinced everyone a threat like this could never happen in the first place. Around us, station security finally began to react, shouting orders, moving delegates away from the platform, activating emergency protocols that should have triggered the moment that first flicker of red light appeared on the floor, protocols that existed only on paper because no one had ever truly believed they would be needed. I did not wait for them. I pulled Ambassador Vexthara O'Keen further behind the questionable cover of the platform's support structure, positioning my own body between her and the direction of the shattered glass, my weapon already drawn and ready, my eyes scanning the space beyond the great window for any sign of a second attempt. "Guard Cole," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, stripped entirely of the confidence and amusement that had defined every word she had spoken to me since her arrival. "What is happening?" "Someone tried to kill you," I said simply, my eyes never leaving the window. "And they are likely still out there, waiting to see if the first shot worked." She stared at me for a long moment, her breathing still uneven, her mind clearly struggling to reconcile the calm, predictable universe she had always known with the sudden, violent reality that had just shattered a hole through the center of it. "How did you know?" she finally asked. "Your systems, your scanners, none of them detected this. How did you know before any of us?" I kept my eyes on the window, my body angled to shield her from whatever might come next, and answered with the simplest truth I had. "Because my species never forgot how," I said, "and yours never had to remember." The words hung in the air between us, heavier than either of us had expected, as the sound of station security finally catching up to a threat their own confidence had allowed to slip past them echoed through the hall around us. But the danger was not over, not yet, because somewhere beyond that shattered glass barrier, whoever had aimed that first shot with such patient, calculated precision was still out there, and I had no intention of giving them a second chance to finish what they had started. I keyed my radio, my voice flat and controlled despite the pounding rhythm of my own heart. "This is Cole. Shots fired in the Grand Hall. Single impact on the reinforced barrier near the central platform. Origin point estimated beyond the outer window, likely a docked vessel or external maintenance platform. I need a full lockdown of all docking bays and external access points, immediately." The response that came back was slower than it should have been, filled with the confused static of a security team that had never trained for a moment like this. "Confirm request. Repeat, shots fired inside the station." I said lockdown. "Now," I snapped, my patience for careful, measured protocol burning away completely. Every second you spend confirming is a second that gives them time to escape or try again. Beside me, still pressed low behind the support structure of the platform, Ambassador Vexthara O'Keen watched me with an expression I had never seen on her before. Not amusement, not doubt, something closer to raw attention, the look of someone finally paying attention to a language they had spent weeks refusing to learn. "You believe there is a vessel," she said quietly, "outside the station." "I believe someone planned this for longer than a few days," I said, my eyes still tracking the shattered glass, watching for any change in the darkness beyond it. The maintenance corridor. The server who was not a server. This shot. All of it connects. Her twin eyes widened slightly, and for the first time, I watched her mind work through the pieces I had been trying to explain for 2 days. Pieces she had dismissed as human paranoia each time I offered them. Around us, station security finally began moving with something resembling urgency, evacuating delegates through the side exits, sealing the Grand Hall's main doors, activating the station's outer defense grid, systems that should have been active from the very beginning of this visit, given everything I had already reported. I helped Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen to her feet, keeping my body angled between her and the shattered window, guiding her quickly toward the reinforced corridor behind the platform, the one route in the hall that offered genuine solid cover rather than glass and open sight lines. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice steadier now, though I could still hear the tremor beneath it. "Somewhere that isn't a floor-to-ceiling window, facing open space," I said. We moved together through the narrow corridor, my weapon still drawn, my eyes checking every junction before we passed through it. 2 other members of the human security detail joined us within moments, falling into position without needing instruction, their own training kicking in now that the threat had become undeniable to everyone, not just to the guard who had been warning them for days. "Cole, talk to us," said one of them, a steady woman named Grace Whitfield who had trained alongside me during the earliest days of the diplomatic program. "What do you have?" "Sniper position, likely mobile, likely external to the station's hull," I said, moving quickly through the details as we walked. The shot came through the outer window near the platform. Whoever fired it knew the exact schedule of the signing ceremony, which means someone inside this station fed them that information. Grace's expression tightened. The server, I confirmed. "He accessed a restricted maintenance corridor 2 days ago. I flagged it. It was dismissed. I believe he was mapping the platform's exposure to the outer window, confirming angles for whoever was waiting outside." Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen, walking close beside me now, finally spoke again, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "You knew all of this, before today, and I dismissed you." I did not answer immediately, focused instead on clearing the next junction of the corridor before allowing our small group to pass through it. When I finally did answer, I kept my voice even, without any trace of satisfaction or blame. "You believed your systems were enough," I said. "That is not a failure unique to you. It is simply what happens to any people who forget, even for a little while, that danger does not always announce itself in ways predictive scanning can catch." We reached a secure security office deep within the station's administrative wing, a room reinforced against exactly this kind of emergency, filled with monitors displaying feeds from cameras across the entire structure. Station security chief, a broad-shouldered man named Peter Ashby, was already inside, coordinating the lockdown with a frantic energy that told me he understood, finally, exactly how badly his earlier decisions had failed. "Cole," he said as we entered, "tell me you have something more than a hunch." "I have a location," I said, moving quickly to one of the monitors and pulling up the external camera feeds along the outer hull near the Grand Hall's window. "Check docking registrations for any vessel positioned within firing range of the platform over the last 6 hours. Ashby's fingers moved quickly across his console, pulling data that should have been checked the moment I filed my first report 2 days earlier. Within moments, a small, unregistered vessel appeared on the feed, tucked against a maintenance platform along the station's outer hull, positioned exactly where I had calculated the shot originating from. "There," I said, "that's our shooter." "It's not responding to hailing," Ashby said, his voice tight, "and it's already disengaging from the platform." "They're running," Grace said. I felt the familiar cold clarity settle over me again, The same feeling that had carried me across the platform floor only minutes earlier, the feeling that made decisions before conscious thought could slow them down. "I need access to the nearest security response craft," I said. "Now." Ashby hesitated only a moment before nodding, relaying orders through his own radio, and within minutes, I found myself moving through the station's transit corridors toward the security bay, Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen close behind me, refusing every suggestion that she remain in the secure office under Grace's protection. "I am not staying behind while you chase down the people who tried to end my life," she said firmly. Any trace of her earlier fear now hardened into something closer to determination. I did not argue. There was no time, and some small part of me understood that she needed to see this through to its end, needed to understand fully what had almost happened and how close the line between safety and disaster had truly been. The security response craft launched within minutes, a small, fast vessel designed for exactly this kind of pursuit, though rarely used given how peaceful the station's history had been until now. I sat at the controls alongside a station pilot named Oliver Grant, while Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen and Grace secured themselves in the seats behind us, watching through the forward viewport as the unregistered vessel accelerated away from the station's outer hull. "They're heading toward the debris field near the old cargo lanes," Oliver said, his hands steady on the controls despite the tension in his voice. "If they reach it, we'll lose them in the clutter." "Then we don't let them reach it," I said. We closed the distance quickly, our craft faster and more maneuverable than the fleeing vessel, built for exactly this kind of pursuit rather than stealth. Through the viewport, I could see the shape of the fleeing craft growing larger, its outer plating scarred and mismatched, clearly modified for exactly the kind of quiet, deniable strike that had almost succeeded only minutes earlier. "They're arming something," Oliver said suddenly, his voice sharpening. "Weapons signature detected." "Evasive," I said immediately, and Oliver banked the craft hard to the side, just as a bright pulse of energy shot past where we had been only a heartbeat before. Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen gasped behind me, gripping the edge of her seat, and for the first time I heard genuine fear in her voice rather than confusion or disbelief. "They are firing on us directly." "They know they've failed once," I said, watching the fleeing craft bank sharply as Oliver adjusted our pursuit angle. "Now they're trying to make sure there are no witnesses left to explain what happened." I moved to the craft's secondary weapons console, a system I had trained on during preparation for exactly this kind of unlikely scenario, one that Solari Security had considered unnecessary given their confidence in prediction over confrontation. "Line me up," I said to Oliver. He adjusted our approach, matching the fleeing craft's erratic movements as best he could, while I tracked its position through the targeting display, waiting for the precise moment its evasive pattern would leave it exposed. The moment came. I fired. A precise, disabling strike caught the fleeing vessel's rear stabilizer, sending it into a slow, uncontrolled spin that stripped away its ability to maneuver further. Oliver brought our own craft alongside it carefully, weapons still trained on the now helpless vessel, as station security reinforcements finally arrived to complete what I had started. Within the hour, the two individuals aboard the disabled craft had been secured and brought into custody, along with the server from the Grand Hall, apprehended attempting to reach a secondary escape point elsewhere on the station. The full details of the plot would take days to unravel completely, tracing back to a faction opposed to the treaty entirely, one that had hoped an assassination during the signing ceremony would collapse the fragile alliance before it could ever truly begin. But in that moment, sitting in the quiet aftermath of the pursuit craft as it powered down within the station's docking bay, none of those details mattered yet. What mattered was Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen, sitting silently in the seat behind me, staring at nothing in particular, finally understanding in the marrow of whatever passed for bones in her species exactly how close she had come to never seeing this moment at all. "You saved my life," she said quietly, the words carrying none of the mockery or amusement that had defined every conversation between us since her arrival. "Twice, in the span of a single day." "That's the job," I said, though even I could hear how hollow the simple explanation sounded after everything that had just happened. She turned to look at me fully, her twin eyes finally moving in unison rather than independently, fixed entirely on my face with an expression I had never seen from her before, something that looked, for the first time since we had met, remarkably like respect. "I do not think," she said slowly, "that it was only the job." I did not know how to answer that, so I said nothing at all, and for once, the silence between us did not feel like the distance she had always insisted on keeping. It felt like something closer to understanding, fragile and new, the kind that only forms after two people have stood together on the wrong side of a single heartbeat and come out the other end of it still breathing. We returned to Meridian Station in silence, the docking bay doors sliding open to reveal a corridor filled with anxious faces, human and Solari alike, waiting for confirmation that the ambassador had survived the chaos that had torn through the Grand Hall only hours before. Grace moved quickly to brief the gathered officials, while Peter Ashby approached me directly, his expression carrying the particular weight of a man who understood exactly how badly he had failed to listen when it mattered most. "Cole," he said quietly, pulling me aside from the crowd, "your reports." The maintenance corridor, the unauthorized server, I dismissed both of them. "You did," I said, without anger, because anger would not undo what had already happened, and the only thing that mattered now was making sure it never happened again. "It won't happen that way next time," he said. "I'm recommending a full review of how threat reports are handled, especially yours. Effective immediately, any concern flagged by human security personnel gets escalated without question, not filtered through predictive models that clearly have blind spots we didn't know existed." I nodded once, accepting the words for what they were, an acknowledgement rather than an apology, which was, in its own way, more useful. Apologies changed nothing. Changed procedure might actually save a life. The following days passed in a blur of investigation and careful reconstruction of exactly what had happened. The server from the Grand Hall, a quiet man who had used the name Victor Hale during his brief employment on the station, confessed under formal questioning to working for a faction within Solari space that opposed the treaty entirely, a group that believed any alliance with a species as unpredictable and violent as humanity represented an unacceptable risk to the stability their civilization had spent centuries building. It was, in a strange and bitter way, the exact fear Ambassador Vexthara Olkian herself had mocked in me only days earlier, twisted into something dangerous by people who had taken it seriously enough to act on it with real violence. The two individuals aboard the disabled vessel turned out to be former security specialists from a Solari colony world, recruited and paid by the same faction, tasked with eliminating the ambassador before the treaty could be finalized, hoping the resulting chaos and grief would collapse negotiations before humanity and the Solari Concord could ever formalize their alliance. Victor Hale, it turned out, had spent nearly 3 weeks embedded within the station's serving staff, using his access to quietly map security blind spots, confirm the ceremony's exact schedule, and relay firing angles to his contacts outside the station. The maintenance corridor I had flagged 2 days before the signing had been exactly what I suspected, a final reconnaissance pass to confirm the platform's exposure to the great curved window before the actual attempt was made. Every piece I had raised, every warning that had been dismissed as human paranoia, turned out to be accurate down to the smallest detail. I did not take satisfaction in being right. There was no comfort in that, not when the margin between success and disaster had come down to a single flicker of red light against a polished floor, noticed only because some ancient, stubborn part of my mind had refused to stop watching for exactly that kind of danger, even in a place everyone else believed had outgrown the need for it. 3 days after the incident, I was summoned to a private meeting room within the diplomatic wing, informed only that Ambassador Vexthara Olkian had requested my presence. I arrived expecting another round of questions about the investigation, another formal debrief to add to the growing pile of reports being filed across both human and Solari agencies. Instead, I found her alone, standing near a wide window that overlooked the slow-turning curve of the earth below, her robes simpler than the elaborate ceremonial fabric she had worn during the signing, her posture less rigid than the careful, performed confidence she had carried since the day she arrived. "Guard Cole," she said, turning to face me as I entered. "Thank you for coming." "You asked," I said simply. "That's usually enough reason." A small, quiet sound escaped her, not quite the amused laughter she had used so often to dismiss me, but something softer, something almost like genuine warmth. "I have spent the last 3 days reviewing the full report of what happened," she said. "The maintenance corridor, the server, the vessel outside the station. Every detail you raised, dismissed by systems and people who believed themselves more capable of predicting danger than a single human relying on instinct alone. Predictive systems aren't wrong to exist," I said carefully. "They just aren't the only thing worth trusting." She studied me for a long moment, her twin eyes moving in unison now. A small detail I had noticed had changed since the attack, as if some part of her had finally learned to focus fully on a single point of attention rather than dividing herself across everything at once. "I ridiculed you," she said quietly, repeatedly, in front of my colleagues, in front of yours. "I called your instincts an old animal reflex, a leftover trait from a species too young to have outgrown its own fear." "You did," I said, without bitterness, because the words no longer carried any weight worth holding on to. "I was wrong," she said simply. "Not only about you, about all of it. My people believed that safety could be engineered so thoroughly that instinct became unnecessary, that fear itself was simply an inefficiency to be designed away. We forgot, over generations of peace, that the universe does not owe us the safety we assumed we had built for ourselves." I said nothing, letting her find her own way through the words, understanding that this was not a moment that needed my input to matter. "You did not simply protect me because it was your assignment," she continued. "You protected me because some part of you never stopped believing that danger could return at any moment, no matter how peaceful the world around you appeared. That belief, which I mocked as primitive, is the exact reason I am still alive to have this conversation with you. Most people don't like being reminded that comfort isn't the same as safety," I said. "It's easier to believe the world has already been made safe than to accept it never fully will be." "Easier," she agreed, "but far more dangerous, as I have now learned in the most direct way possible." She turned back toward the window, watching the earth continue its slow rotation beneath the station, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into something more formal, more deliberate. "I have submitted a request to the Solari Concord's Diplomatic Council," she said. "Effective immediately, all future ambassadors visiting human territory and all human representatives visiting Solari space will be assigned dedicated human security personnel as a mandatory condition of diplomatic protocol, regardless of local predictive security capabilities." I raised an eyebrow slightly, surprised by the weight of what she was describing. "That's a significant change." "It is," she said, "and it is necessary. My people have much to offer this alliance: resources, technology, centuries of careful diplomatic experience. But we have forgotten something your species has never had the luxury of forgetting, and until we relearn it properly, we will need people like you standing beside us, watching for the things our own systems cannot yet imagine." She turned back to face me fully, her expression carrying none of the mockery or amusement that had defined our earlier days together. "I have also requested," she added, "that you personally remain assigned as my primary security escort for the remainder of my diplomatic tenure, if you are willing to accept the position." I considered the request for a long moment, thinking back over the weeks of quiet insults, the dismissed reports, the small red dot that had nearly ended everything in the space of a single breath. "I'll accept," I said, "on one condition." Her twin eyes narrowed slightly, curiosity replacing the last traces of her earlier vulnerability. "And what condition is that, Guard Cole?" "Next time I flag a maintenance corridor," I said, "or an unauthorized server, or anything else that doesn't sit right with me, it gets taken seriously the first time." Not after someone puts a laser sight on your chest. A small, genuine smile crossed her face. The first true smile I had seen from her since her arrival, free of any mockery or performance. Agreed, she said. Completely and without reservation. The treaty signing was rescheduled for the following week, held this time in a reinforced interior chamber with no exposure to open space, no easy angles for anything hiding beyond the station's hull. Security protocols had been rewritten entirely in the days following the attack, drawing directly from recommendations I submitted alongside Grace Whitfield and Peter Ashby, blending human vigilance with Solari predictive technology in a way that finally acknowledged the strengths of both approaches rather than dismissing one in favor of the other. I stood in my usual position, 3 steps behind Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen, as she signed the final treaty documents alongside the human diplomatic representatives, formally establishing the alliance that would shape the future of both our species for generations to come. The room was quieter this time, more careful, filled with people who had learned, in the hardest way possible, that peace and safety were never quite the same thing. When the ceremony ended, and the gathered delegates began filing out to celebrate the completion of the treaty, Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen paused beside me, glancing back with an expression that carried none of the distance she had shown during our first days together. "Guard Cole," she said quietly. "Daniel." It was the first time she had used my given name. "Yes, Ambassador," I said. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing what the rest of us could not." I nodded once, keeping my eyes moving across the room out of habit, checking doors, windows, the small gaps of silence that sometimes told me more than any conversation could. Old instincts, carved deep enough that they no longer felt like choices. "That's the job," I said again, though this time, both of us understood it had never really been only that. Outside the reinforced chamber, the earth continued its slow turn beneath the station, indifferent to treaties and ceremonies, to old fears finally taken seriously, and new alliances finally built on something sturdier than blind confidence. Somewhere out there, in the vast quiet of space, other dangers waited, that no one yet knew how to imagine, the kind that would eventually test this fragile new alliance in ways neither species could yet predict. But for the first time since her arrival, Ambassador Vexthara Olkeen walked through that station with a human guard she no longer saw as decoration, no longer dismissed as an outdated leftover of a younger, more primitive world. She walked instead with someone she finally understood as necessary, someone whose instincts, forged through generations of danger her own people had long since forgotten, remained the sharpest tool either of our species possessed against a universe that had never promised safety to anyone. And I walked 3 steps behind her, exactly where I belonged, watching every shadow, every window, every quiet space where danger might still be waiting, because that instinct, the one she had once called primitive, was the very thing that had kept her alive and would keep her alive, for as long as I remained the one standing guard.